Really delighted to have this event here today and welcome Jeff Wasserstrom and Evan Osnos. Jeff is a writer of many different types. He's just recently published this book, The Milk Tea Alliance, which we'll be talking about today. But Jeff, I couldn't read his whole bio because there's too many interesting nuggets to get into. I would never be able to get to the actual content. He's the Chancellor's Professor of History at UC Irvine, where he also holds courtesy affiliations in the law and literary journalism. He writes on China, he writes on history, he writes very publicly on history. He also has an incredible online presence, so you should follow him on social media if you don't, just to get some really interesting takes on both contemporary events and how they connect to the past. So we're delighted to have him here. And Evan Osnos needs no introduction. The New Yorker correspondent, he's been staff writer since at the New Yorker since 2008. And from 2008 to 2013, he served as the magazine's China correspondent, where I think many in this room, enjoyed hearing about your experiences in China from all different types of environments, whether they're, formal, informal, high and low. So we appreciated that correspondence coverage. But Evan also has shifted his focus away from just focusing on China to focusing on other types of issues as well, whether they be elsewhere in Asia or his new focus is really here domestically in the US. And his new book comes out, I think, today or very recently. The Haves and the Have-Yachts, Dispatches on the Ultra Rich, which has just come out, and we have copies in the back. So we have this, two incredible experts here today. The structure for this event will really be letting the two of them talk in dialogue. For those in the room, we'll open up for Q&A and bring you into the conversation. After the conversation formally ends, we'll also have a reception here in the room and an opportunity to buy the book and have your book signed by the two authors here. We have both Jeff and Evan's books for sale from our friends JF Books in the back. So if you want to pick up a copy and get it signed, please feel free to at the end of the event. And then lastly, I'll just say a few words about this program with China Connections. So we are talking about China, but we have two both China experts who've really broadened their scope to cover both China and China's connections beyond China's borders. And this series, housed here at GW University, is something new for the U.S.-China Education Trust. It's a monthly program, and our goal is to expand the interest in China among Americans, and particularly focus on the next generation of China experts, helping them think, get in touch and get to hear from people who've spent their career thinking about China and who've experienced time on the ground when that might be more difficult for some generations coming ahead in the China field. And also really understand what you can do with the knowledge of China. And I think our two experts here have a really interesting perspective of folks who started in China, brought that experience into different sectors and different ways of communicating to American audiences about Asia in their writing, whether it's academic writing or public writing. So with that kind of framing in mind, we really are looking forward to both hearing from them and getting to bring the audience into the conversation after the formal discussion. So thanks so much for joining us, and over to you guys.
Thank you. Everybody can, okay, I think. I thank you, Rosie. I want to say it is a pleasure to be here with the U.S.-China Education Trust, with Julia, and of course here to talk about Jeff's extraordinary work, both in this book. And before we get into that, I just want to say also a word or two about what I think Jeff tells us about this kind of work, this subject. Also, more importantly, I think what it means to be a public intellectual in this time. That is a term some people would take for themselves. Jeff is way too modest to do so. He is, in fact, has to have somebody else say it. And I am such an admirer of Jeff on multiple fronts, one of which has to do with being a kind of global citizen, meaning genuinely at home here, but also in China and in the places we're going to talk about in Southeast Asia and beyond. But there is Jeff has a relentless curiosity that I find inspiring as somebody who tries to write for a living too. But also, this is, I think everybody should know that Jeff is really admired in my world for being somebody who has a great sense of professional citizenship, for reaching out to younger, newer people in this world. And it's a tough world of trying to write about this place that can be sometimes prickly to the touch, and writing about a country that has high barriers to entry, both in terms of language and the depth of knowledge required to say something new and original. And I have been the beneficiary of Jeff's sort of generosity of spirit for a very long time. And so to be able to do this together is a real treat for me and very gratifying to be able to now grill him mercilessly about his work after saying such nice things. Now, after, I won't give you a chance to rebut. I want to go into something that's related to what I was just talking about, which is that long before there was Facebook or Twitter, there was Jeff Wasserstrom, meaning the idea of drawing connections between different thinkers and different disciplines and different doctrines and different pieces of history is something that I think, Jeff, you've done sort of intuitively for a very long time. But having, of course, made your name as a historian, you are, if I may, at the risk of insulting you, you're coming closer to my profession here. You're beginning to behave a bit like a journalist, writing about things that are not yet clarified by time. And I wonder how you think about this, why you are increasingly consenting to the current age and writing about things that don't yet make sense.
That's a great way, and I wish I could reciprocate with the love fest, but I don't get to then do the tough grilling, so I'm not gonna do it. But I will mention this about how how a nice historian like me ended up hanging out with the journalists, and actually there were two parts to this. My dissertation was about student protests in China before 1949, in Shanghai in particular. And I went to Shanghai to work on this dissertation in 1986. And when I arrived, I was told, it's too bad by some of the professors there, it's too bad you're interested in student protesters because, I mean, it's good you're working on you're a historian because this new generation, they really, all they care about is perming their hair and listening to the latest music. They're not gonna protest. If you thought you might have seen something like what you study, no way. And then there were protests at the end of 1986 that turned out to be the sort of warm-up protests for Tiananmen. And yeah, my advisors thought my topic was a good topic. The pre-49 protests helped bring the Communist Party to power. They were happy about that. Then they got a little nervous when there were current protests, and they said to me, well, there are some things going out on the streets, but you're not interested in that because you're a historian, right? And I said, oh, no. And then I would spend the morning in the archives and the afternoons on the streets. And so it was just automatic that I would think that the past and present deserve to be talked about together. And the students had just been educated in, they had been exposed to stories about the good protests of the past, because these were hallowed events in the Chinese Communist Party history, but told not to go on the streets. But when they went on the streets, they were kind of following the scripts and redoing some of the things that they had learned about, which was natural. Then I come back, I write my dissertation, I file my dissertation in the spring of 1989, right as the protests are exploding. And then I think, oh my gosh, I was reading journalism, and some of it was very good about Tiananmen, but on the whole, the press coverage, the way Americans were learning about what was happening in China was kind of relentlessly connecting it to the protests against Communist Party rule in Eastern and Central Europe going on at the same time. And that was partly relevant, but partly misleading, because the Chinese protesters wanted the Communist Party to live up to its own goals, not to do and to put an end to Communist Party rule, which was happening in Eastern Europe. The protesters, and this was maybe, it took me a while to get to it, but one of these kind of curious analogies I came up with, I thought the Chinese protesters in 1989 were more like Prague Spring, 68 protesters in Eastern Europe who wanted socialism with a human face, wanted something like what they had. But really, the students were talking a lot about what had happened in China in 1919 and other kind of hallowed events. And so I thought, that's what I was studying, and these are really relevant. So I'll write something for a magazine. And through a family connection, there was somebody at the then quite really good Los Angeles Times Sunday magazine, had a magazine, and they offered to read what I wrote. And if I would come up with a draft, taking the lessons from my dissertation, I thought, okay, my dissertation is 350 pages with hundreds of notes. I know I can't send that in. So I'll write something really simplified and boiled down. which was 35 pages and 67 notes. And they just said, in fact, like, you don't know what you're doing. And so I thought, like, I want to figure out how to do it so that if I ever am working on a topic that is relevant in the same way, I'll be able to do it. And I began to think about how hard it was to do some of the things that journalists did. Luckily, I was then, I lucked into being a consultant for filmmakers who were making a film about Tiananmen, the Gate of Heavenly Peace. And that film became one of the most important documents on Tiananmen. And I realized I had very little influence, but I got a few sentences in. And those few sentences really affected things. And then the next time I wanted to write for a newspaper, when something came up, I thought, well, you can only write 800 words. That's not so short, because I could only do a couple of sentences into Gate of Heavenly Peace. So it broke it up. But there were other things along the way that went there. But I need to tell Evan that you were a part of my shift toward journalism in a very funny way. And this will give me a chance to praise him a little bit. I
might cut you off.
Yeah, we'll figure this out. There was a time when I don't know if anybody remembers this, but a Starbucks opened in the Forbidden City, and this became a story. And I think the way some of the story was, wouldn't Mao be rolling over in his grave because Starbucks is opening, a symbol of capitalism, in a sacred site within China? And my sense was, no, actually, Mao would be surprised that the Forbidden City was being rethought as a sacred. So he would be doubly kind of confused by it. So Evan obviously doesn't remember this, but he was working for I sent it to the op-ed to the Chicago Tribune. And they had a op-ed editor who said, I think this is really good, but we have this kid in China reporting for us, and he actually knows something about China. So I'm going to send it to him to see. So you were a gatekeeper, and thank goodness he said it was all right. So I'm very grateful to you for getting me into that paper. And but the editor at the op-ed editor at the Chicago Tribune also, I want to get his predictions on the stock market, because he also said, look, this guy is not going to be at the Chicago Tribune much longer. He's going places. So I thought, okay, I want to meet this guy.
You know, this will give you a sense of how long history is and how all of us move around. Remember, the person who made that protest against Starbucks at the Forbidden City was Ray Chung-gang, who was a prominent figure on Chinese television at the time, who ended up then getting drawn into the Xi Jinping anti-corruption dragnet, went to prison, came back out, and is now a YouTube star living in
Oh my God,
the United States. So history has only barely begun. And by the way, Howard Schultz has a giant yacht. Anyway, I'm sorry, I got distracted.
It always comes back to yacht.
It does.
Yeah.
It does. Here's my question. You've returned. There's an old saying that writers really only have one topic that we're interested in. We find different ways to write it for the course of a career. Protest for you has been a defining dynamic. And I'm curious why. Why protest? What does it tell you about societies? What is it? Is it the energy of it? Is it the sense of a seam in history? Is it the sense of potential? What is it that draws you to that and then becomes a frame for understanding not just China, but elsewhere?
Wow, one topic. I've actually got two. Does that make me okay?
This and guitar?
No, protest and Orwell, George
Okay.
Orwell.
Right.
Now,
That's great.
more kind of dystopian fiction. So, but protest, the story of protest, and, maybe inevitably we're going to be talking about Asia, but we will also be talking about America. Right. One of the things that I really remember, and when I was trying to figure out why I was drawn to protest as a subject, when I was a kid, I was taken to anti-Vietnam War protests by my family. And at one of the first of those, music does come into this inevitably, which is another thing. Joan Baez was singing. And it was outside the federal building in LA. And it was just, I wasn't religious, but there was something about a whole group singing along that was kind of transporting. And also the fact that when there were these marches that people, by that point, the movement had been going on for quite a while, people all seemed to know what to do. And it's like, I was trying to figure out why it was so, or later, when I look back on it and I was trying to study, moments of upheaval, I thought, like, how do people get a sense of what to do? And that's when I talked about the students in Shanghai taking on traditions, reenacting scripts from the past. That was what I guess what fascinates me about protests is partly the scenes, but like how do large groups of people who haven't acted together get a sense of what to do? And so I had that early in my career, and then I moved completely away from protests. I thought it was over as a story of China, that there really weren't protests in China. I returned a bit to protest in 1999 when there were anti-American protests or anti-NATO protests that I was there to observe. But I mostly was writing about other things about the city of Shanghai. And then Hong Kong came along, and there was this sort of same sense of watching something in which large numbers of people somehow figured out what to do together, and they seemed to be drawing on doing things that rhymed with what had been done in the Chinese past, but also were influenced by international currents.
That idea, you used the word earlier, a script, is a really powerful concept in understanding the transmission of technique and inspiration. And one of the things I find thrilling in some of the work you've done, both in this book and also before, is looking at the way that there's a kind of technology transfer intellectually between protest movements in various places. What is it that brought you from China ultimately to begin to look in a serious way at Thailand?
So it was, again, I guess I hadn't thought about it quite this way. I felt like the May 4th tradition of protest, the way I thought of protests on the mainland, had reached a dead end after Tiananmen. And so I stopped with that. In the Hong Kong case, and look, the Tiananmen protests were amazing in many ways, and their lasting legacy in the kind of global imagination is a man standing in front of a tank, which has become this kind of symbol of incredible bravery. But there was nothing that the students at Tiananmen did that provided a script that people in other places then adapt. They didn't add anything to the global repertoire of protest, really. They drew from many different parts of the world. They drew from their own past, but there was nothing kind of new. With Hong Kong, there was discussion after Hong Kong reached that kind of dead end locally with the imposition of the national security law in 2020. There was talk actually in many parts of the world about learning from Hong Kong, the be water strategy of flexible protests, of waiting to the last minute and using new social media to pick a protest site, trying to be a leaderless movement, using creative techniques to disarm tear gas, like putting traffic cones on top of them, and heavy reliance on popular culture and certain kind of globally circulating tactics and symbols. It's not like it all started with Hong Kong, but here was a case where Hong Kong was providing a model. There were people in Belarus, there were people in Minneapolis who were talking about learning from Hong Kong, but especially there were protesters in Thailand who, by the fall of 2020, were doing things that looked a lot and sometimes sounded a lot like what I had been following in Hong Kong. So here was like the script or repertoire moving from Hong Kong to Thailand, and they're both in Asia, but they're in different parts of Asia. So somehow it was someplace nearby, but in a different cultural milieu. So I thought of it, and later I've seen other people use this metaphor for other things. It was like a baton was passed, and for a pro-democracy relay race, and it was passed to Thailand. And then in 2020, and then in early 2021, there was a latest coup in Burma, aka Myanmar, and protesters there were doing things that looked a lot like what had just been happening in Thailand and had some connections to Hong Kong. And some Hong Kong activists were posting online lessons we learned from our protests that might be useful there. And suddenly I thought of this interconnectedness between these places. And I had always been interested in the Central and Eastern European movements of failed movements, 1956, 68, 1981, and then successful movements in 1989, and the way that activists in Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Hungary seemed connected. And I saw something that was similar in this kind of moving around a region. And I am a historian. I had also just read a wonderful book by Tim Harper called Underground Asia that was about how activists from Vietnam, the Philippines, China, and other places around 1900 were learning from each other and meeting up because they were in nearby places. So I'm fascinated by that.
I mean, there's an interesting parallel, which is it's not just the protesters who are learning from each other. One of the things we learned when the Stasi archives opened in East Germany was that the Stasi had been learning from Chinese Ministry of State Security and vice versa about how to handle and monitor people. I think Mary Surratt has it in her book, but there is this kind of fascinating way in which both the security services were also trying to learn best practices, in effect. I'm curious, you mentioned that you didn't think that Tiananmen had a similar kind of international effect. Why do you think that didn't happen? Because of course it was self-referential. You talked about May 4th. There was even the kind of reference to 86 in the 89 generation. And I remember I was a student in college a few years after Tiananmen, and I took a class that was all on that subject, taught by Rod McFarquhar. He did a whole class on 89, but in order to understand 89, he said you have to start with the Qin Emperor and then work your way forward. And he wasn't wrong about that. That there was, it was this kind of pebble on the top of this historical pile. But I'm interested: is there something essentially self-referential about a Chinese vocabulary of protest that's different than if it was something in the middle of Europe?
So the Tiananmen movement did have it. I would meet with some Eastern European activists afterwards, and they would say, some of them did say, we were inspired by Tiananmen. And some of what and I would say, like, after we saw what happened, we were more encouraged to take action. Whereas it's a kind of this is also something about protest. There's not a pure rational thing. It has also emotional, symbolic, and other things. And I thought, the lesson, if you're in East Germany, and actually the East German government was saying maybe we should carry out a Chinese solution, they were calling when there were protesters on the streets. But what they were saying was that images like the Tank Man made them think, if somebody can do that in such a dire situation, why aren't we willing to, stand up when there aren't tanks on the streets? So it had an impact, but it just didn't, I think, add something new to the mix. Whereas the fact that Hong Kong did, I think this is an interesting way to think about Hong Kong protests influence. Hong Kong was the best kind of soft power the PRC had. Hong Kong movies have been copied by Hollywood, whereas I don't think yet any Chinese-made movie has had a successful remaking in Hollywood. That's one way to think about soft power, and one way to think about the Beijing's squashing of Hong Kong. If they really want soft power, they should have kept it different, because you had things like The Departed. Martin Scorsese says, like, they're doing something really great there. I mean, maybe there's definitely been influence from some things from China, but Hong Kong had this kind of ability to mix and match and add its own twist to it that then reached beyond it.
When you went to Thailand, and to the degree that you were also researching Burma, this was not your native habitat. What was the experience like of kind of having a beginner's mind at a place that you're trying to understand?
Yeah, well, I really relate to this when I've been reading some of Evan's work, because he had to adjust to a really new environment of being in a
Washington,
really
D.C.
a really big luxury yacht.
That's true. That's true.
Living a life of luxury.
Yeah.
So I want to tell you about my
Demanding.
first days in Bangkok, was, I mean, I have luckily I have a very good friend, Emma Larkin, who wrote
Mm.
an amazing book on Burma, Finding George Orwell in Burma, um, who I guess is obsessed by the two things I am, because she's very interested in protests and resistance to authoritarianism and George Orwell. So she was the perfect person to hang out with in Bangkok the first time I got there. And she had hired a driver, a modest car, not a limousine, but we hired a driver, and she told him about her American friend who was here in Bangkok for the first time, and we wanted to go to the site of the commemorative plaques for the massacre of 1976. And then there's a famous one on, and we looked, and then she said, and you know, now we need to go to the 1992 one. And he's looking at me like I'm just an idiot. Like my first trip to Bangkok, and these are the places I want to see. We've got a hired driver, and I don't want to see a beautiful temple. I don't want to see a street market. It's just no. And we're having this all, excited conversation about it. Yeah, so it was this dystopian tourism, but I did have one experience as a which relates to your world, your current world, which was that I went there in 2022 after the protest, but I wanted to meet up with people who had been very involved in the protests and talk to them. And it was still just after COVID opening up, so there really weren't many foreign tourists coming in there. So the Conrad Hotel in Bangkok had this incredibly cheap room. I thought it was about $100 a night, and I had some funds from Columbia Global Reports to help with my travel expenses, but I couldn't have stayed there in the height of their. It's the most beautiful hotel I've ever been in. It's really luxurious, but for $100 a night, it was amazing. So I had this glorious luxurious bathroom, and it had these plush white robes that you got on, and all these kinds of things. You can relate. Right?
Oh, sure.
Right?
Yeah.
And I then was meeting one of the activists, and the activist, his name is Francis, and I barely talk about him in the book. I picked another Thai activist who I think is even more fascinating at multiple levels, but Francis was a close second. Francis was had been inspired by Hong Kong. There was a Hong Kong song, Glory to Hong Kong, that became an anthem to the protests at the end. And then if you sang it on the streets of Hong Kong, you would be arrested now. Even a busker who played the melody got in trouble. But Francis decided to show his solidarity with Hong Kong. He would go outside the Chinese embassy in Bangkok and sing the song Glory to Hong Kong. Because, what were they going to do? It would taunt them. He chose National Day, October 1st, to go out there and do that. But he then got in trouble also he got accused of not a version of lèse majesté, because he had been a leader of a protest that had accidentally blocked the motorcade of the Queen. He ended up getting off on that because he hadn't specifically, he tried to actually get the protesters to move. But anyway, Francis actually happened to have a car, and he picked me up. He lived outside of Bangkok, and he picked me up, and we were going to see some sites. And I said, yeah, I'm staying in this really nice hotel. I don't usually stay in. I'm trying to relate to the people. And he goes, oh, I've stayed there. I said, yeah, but it's really cheap. I mean, I said, I don't usually stay there. He said, how much you paying? I said, and he said, oh, no, that's not cheap. During the protests in 2020, COVID movements were allowed within Thailand, but you really couldn't go in at all as a foreign tourist. So they were desperate. Nobody was renting their rooms there. So it was like $15 a night. And Francis said he lived outside of the city, and he would be protesting at night, and the protests would go late, and he'd need to be organizing the next morning. So it'd be really nice to just check into the hotel. And I said, yeah, and it's really nice, the bathrobes. He goes, oh yeah, that shower was great for washing tear gas off you.
I want to get back to China in a second, but before I do, I'm interested. One more question on this question of protest, because here we are talking a day before there are going to be protests in many American cities. As you know, the reason I have kind of gravitated to this idea of writing about inequality in the United States is precisely because I get the feeling that we are edging into uncertain territory. In fact, it's unprecedented when it comes to strict measurements of inequalities of wealth in this country. And you're beginning to see in the data on public attitudes that we're approaching a point when people regard this as crossing a threshold of America's tolerance for inequality. As you think about protest, what ignites it, what doesn't ignite it, are Americans so mesmerized by our phones? Are we so disenchanted by politics, so cynical that people won't actually organize, do you think, in response to not just a president who is so polarizing but also, do you think Americans will ultimately find themselves in protest against a system that is increasingly described by more and more Americans as unfair and preventing them from achieving their aspirations?
So one thing that you learn studying protests is studying social movements is how incredibly unpredictable,
Mm.
how many decisions are being made by incredible numbers of people, and so how utterly unpredictable they are. And um, in Hong Kong, when I was working on this book, Vigil, about the Hong Kong protests, I thought I was going to end it with the June 4th vigil of 2019. I was going to go to this big anniversary commemoration of the 1989 massacre in Beijing. And I thought the period of protests for Hong Kong, the great protests, were probably over. People felt very despondent. They felt they'd tried everything and it hadn't worked. Yes, there were some protests going on, but I was going to end with this elegiac kind of comment. I was here at this moment. This you can do in Hong Kong. You can't do on the mainland. You can only do it in Macau, another place. How much longer? Soon there will probably come a time when you can't even have that protest. I was going to end the book there. I was starting to write it. I was going to do the history of the 2010s and then this endpoint. I had a plane ticket for June 8th to go back to the United States. At the end of the June 4th protest in 2019, the speakers said, "We've been talking about the past, but now let's think about the future in Hong Kong. Sorry, a week from now, come back to Victoria Park. Let's do it in even bigger numbers and push for an end to an extradition bill." That was one thing that got people angry, that people might be taken out of their area, perhaps for political terms, into a place where there were no kinds of legal protections. This seemed a very technical kind of thing to protest, but it doesn't actually seem so much anymore now with our experience. But I then went to one more protest to observe. There was a silent march by lawyers to protest what they saw as the death of rule of law in Hong Kong that seemed to be coming. And I thought, okay, that will be my end point. And then I'll do that. Then I get back to the United States, and the news is that a giant protest of perhaps 1 million people happened right after I had left. And I would feel so foolish that I hadn't changed my plane ticket and just stayed a little longer, except nobody I was talking to in the movement said, "What are you doing leaving if you're studying this kind of thing? We're going to have this giant." They hoped there would be a giant protest, but they honestly didn't know, even the people most in the movement. But I think one of the things you brought up is, another theme that you get from a series of protests is that, and I think this is a fundamental issue about understanding Tiananmen. The largest protests are when the largest number of people feel a sense of, I mean, this is kind of obvious, relate to the grievance that you're rallying around. And so the Tiananmen protest was described often as a democracy movement, but the posters that were up in Chinese, the posters in English said things like "Give me liberty" or "Give me death," "Goddess of democracy." But the posters in Chinese focused on nepotism and corruption.
Yeah.
So I think if there is going to be something potentially, I think this is why your book is so important coming out at this moment, that there are all sorts of ways of talking about what is going wrong. But one of the ways to talk about it is about very, very rich people getting richer in a way that, and having more direct influence in the government than we have seen in the past. And to say that the places that we've seen that has been in other parts of the world.
Yeah.
But there's also, you mentioned an insularity within China. There's an insularity within the United States often of only thinking within its own traditions, whereas at this, one of the ways that there are ways of criticizing what's going on that draw. You don't have to just go to Germany in the 1930s. You can point to other places and think about, is that what we really want to seem like? Quinn Slobodian put a piece in the New York Times where he talked about parallels between what's going on here and Saudi Arabia. And then if you kind of say, is that what you imagine this country properly being like? Anyway, so that's, I'm not going to, but I'm really not going to predict it. The other thing I would say I've only learned, this is the only other thing I've learned because you mentioned cell phones, is that I mentioned in 1986, there were the, people telling me that this generation wouldn't protest. You heard that again in the United States. You've heard it in Hong Kong in the 2010s. Young people in Hong Kong are not really interested in politics right before they then did. And in the US, there was an idea of a generation that was just on their cell phones. And then in Washington, D.C., when I was here in the 2010s, there was the protest by the Parkland survivors, which was an enormous protest. It didn't last. You also often learn, and this is maybe the cautionary thing, often protests only when the protests that do have an effect often have an effect after a very long time. There's a gradual process to it. And so people need to think about not just whether one moment will change things, but whether it will be something that continues.
Sustained attention, which is the hardest thing these days for any of us. In a second, we're going to open this up for questions. And Rosie, remind me on timing. Is that about right? For just one other question I had for you, Jeff, before we do that. On China, you wrote a piece a few years ago that got a lot of attention because you identified a problem, like a void. At the time, there were no biographies of Xi Jinping. In fact, it was a kind of huge, glaring, unaddressed need in global discourse about power. We've begun to get a little bit more writing about Xi Jinping. Still a hard target as a research subject. I'm curious what you think remains unknown to us, or perhaps what are some misconceptions either about Xi himself or about the era of Xi Jinping that you would want to know. And if you were a young scholar or journalist, what are some of the things you would be poking around to try to describe about China today that perhaps the world doesn't get?
So when I wrote that, I was thinking that it was just extraordinary because there was a biography of Kim. There were biographies of all the kind of strongmen you could do. There weren't about Xi, and it was very hard, a black box kind of thing about Chinese elite politics. But there also had been no kind of defector from his inner circle, and so it was just a fascinating phenomenon. And I did praise your Born Red profile, the New Yorker, as at that point one of the most insightful things that we had. And then a couple of books on Xi Jinping came out, and I think if anybody had written a book, there were a few books. There was things like Inside the Mind of Xi Jinping, which was an analysis of his speech, what you could learn about him from his speeches. You could find out what the official Xi Jinping was. Then there were a couple of other books that still, without getting quite at it, there were a couple of books out, and for me to say that, you could learn a lot from the New Yorker article, maybe that was slightly insulting to somebody who had written a whole book. But then I read a review of in the TLS of a couple of the books that had come out, and they said you could actually learn more from a podcast that The Economist had done. And The Economist really did a very good podcast, where what they did was they spent a lot of time talking to people who had grown up adjacent to Xi Jinping and tried to capture what kind of thing he was. we're starting to get more of a feel. Lucy Hornby just did a great piece about analyzing the hagiographic biography. I said there are hagiographies of Xi Jinping produced within China. And those don't really get at him, but then she did an analysis of what we learn about what is part of the cult around that. We're starting to get more. We have an impressive biography of his father, Xi Zhongxun, by Joseph Derigian, who's we're competing with each other's book talks right now in different places, hopscotching around places. But we still haven't gotten anything that's a real texture of it. And what's interesting, and it does say something about how closed off that Xi Jinping doesn't sit down with foreign reporters. It's a different thing. Jiang Zemin did famously an interview with Barbara Walters, and you can't imagine that that kind of thing happening. So there's a closed offness. I did get approached by after I wrote that, an editor at Norton contacted me and said, "Well, since there's no biography of Xi Jinping, would you write it?" I was like, "Well, I just explained how incredibly hard it was to do that." But it was the best effort somebody could do. They said, "No, what I was thinking was Jonathan Spence wrote these imaginative biographies, including of emperors, where you had to kind of venture toward toward the kind of realm of historical fiction, but staying as true as you can to things." Like a lot of you, I was drawn into Chinese studies, part by reading The Death of Woman Wang and other magical kind of works by Jonathan Spence. I think he might have been the first person who I heard give a public talk about Chinese history. And he was very supportive of me early in my career, even though I didn't study with him. So, that was hitting the right spot. But I said, no, actually, I want to follow this story. I want to write something about profiles of people struggling from the bottom. So, but in terms of what there is about the Xi era, there was this quite amazing period that Pankaj Mishra described. He talked about a group of ethnographic kind of journalistic books on China that came out during a period of relative opening. He talked about Peter Hessler, Ian Johnson, and John Pomfret's books when they came out, and talked about, he was thinking about how valuable they were at getting a feel of life. And this is the last thing to mention about Evan and my connections, is around that time when there were some scholars moving into this public writing, Anjali Shah, a journalist, and I came up with this idea of getting the writers on both sides of this, serious journalists and journalistic scholars, to write to do a collection of profiles together. And I would edit the journalists. We invited this youngster, Evan Osnos, into the group. We had Ian Johnson, we had Alec Ash, we had a whole group of people. Leslie Chong wrote a piece for us, and I got to edit them. And Anjali, meanwhile, edited the academics to make sure they left all some of their footnotes at the door. And there too, some of the people who I think have been were writing most powerfully. James Millward wrote something, and other academics moving in, people who fell in between. But I think that was a moment when it felt you could be in China just kind of poking around in a way that now it's really hard to do. And I thought maybe those kinds of books that were gone. Emily Fang's book, I think, is maybe one of the hopefully it won't be one of the last ones. Hopefully people will get another opportunity to do that. But she got there just in time in the mid 2010s when there was still some space. And she writes very well about that narrowing of the space and the narrowing of different ways to be Chinese, and the government trying to force everybody to be on the same page, where it doesn't work. In China, there's always going to be local variation and other things, but the central authority does not always try to push everybody to conform to one form of Chineseness. And I do think that's one of the crucial things about Xi and the period actually just before Xi took power in 2009 on, where there's been a push toward that. So that's I would have said before her book came out, that was the book I would have wanted somebody to write.
Folks, I'm sure you have questions. If you have anything you'd like to ask Jeff, please go ahead. Got a microphone. Is open. If not, I have another question while people are formulating. Would you, Jeff, if you were, would you go to China now, by the way, to do research or reporting?
I've actually written about why I'm not going to China now, but also crucially, I wrote in that I want other people to go to China, and that I have a very specific reason that I feel for me. First of all, I don't have to go. There's nothing compelling me to go for my career. I'm at a stage beyond where I need to do that. I don't have family connections in China. So I think it's very important that there not be any kind of critical view of people who make a different choice than me. And actually, I like to talk to people who have been there, come back. And I do think there's a very specific reason, and I'll kind of back it up. When I wrote about Tiananmen a lot, people said, oh, well, you probably won't get a visa. I kept getting a visa. I really don't think the Communist Party cares what people write about it in English. Or to some, the topic, there are very specific topics that they occasionally care about, like investigating the private lives of families at certain points, Xinjiang, but simply writing about dissent and things like that. What does get increasing pressure on you is if you are seen as amplifying the voices in Chinese of people that they want to silence, or if you are like friends with helping dissidents and figures. And when I studied the Tiananmen generation, others, I studied them at a distance. When I was studying the Hong Kong equivalents of them, I didn't think that was the same deal, because I thought Hong Kong was different enough. There were no visas. There was nothing. There had not been the same kind of harsh punishments of people who protested in Hong Kong. So I got closer to some of the people there. So now I've done public events with people who have bounties on their heads, and I think that if I went to Hong Kong, I would be so closely watched that I wouldn't want to go to see the friends I have still there who are trying to be less obvious. So I feel like Hong Kong, the place I became so attached to, is off limits to me. And so I don't want to go to the mainland when I can't go to Hong Kong. But I do encourage other people to go. I think it's very important for people to study there if they're interested in it. And I want them to tell me all the stories about what I'm missing.
Thank you. My name is Rebecca, and I'm a first year Elia graduate student. So thank you for coming here and hosting this event. My question is, right now, I think you can see a lot of civil disobedience in China in terms of like not having children, not getting married, refusing to, give in to a lot of the pressures that the government's giving, but not necessarily protest in the streets, because obviously, like you said, Tiananmen Square in Hong Kong, what happened during those periods still very much haunts people in fear of getting themselves into trouble. So where exactly in China right now do you see that has the most potential for perhaps not, a complete democratic reform, but, small social changes that can be made?
That's great. I love the way you phrase that too. I mean, there are protests in China on individual issues that are not on sort of like broad topics. And if they're, I mean, it's changed a little, but there's been, to an extent after Tiananmen, quite steadily, the Chinese Communist Party cracks down very hard on anything that seems to organize people across class lines or across regions, across places. Um, I think it's very important for people who don't pay a lot of attention to China in the United States, especially when there are narratives that try to make you think of all people in China the same, that are coming from Xi Jinping from this process and coming from the White House too, in a thing. I think it's very important to note what you just did, that there are kinds of ways in which people are not not protesting, but not going along with the official lines, the lying flat, kind of sort of opting out itself, when of not joining into the nationalist project. So because it can easily to think you hear the most, the loudest nationalist voices, and you think of that as kind of being about all the people of China, which just isn't true at all.
Yeah, I will mention that I remember when I was in China a couple of years ago, particularly talking to people about the decision not to get married and the lying flat phenomenon. I very much did perceive that Tangping and things like that were becoming a form of expression. And I remember a dinner with a young woman who I said, do you expect to get married and have kids?" She was speaking mostly in Chinese, but she switched to English and said, "That's a hard no." And I thought, well, that's quite an eloquent political expression if I've ever heard one.
And you also had things that like can seem one of the things, okay, that I just want to plug this book a little bit. It's again, it's very much about the place in protest of things that can seem kind of frivolous, like songs and cosplaying things from popular culture. And I think so in on the this is not about the mainland. It's about Hong Kong, Thailand, and Burma. But on the mainland, some of that goes there too. So there was the white paper protest, which was people very daringly taking the streets. But then later there were Halloween. Halloween was celebrated in Shanghai with people doing things like dressing up as a surveillance camera.
Hmm.
And is that's something that's poking at the government and dressing up like they were cosplaying things from Lu Xun's writing, which is a way of
Right.
subtly kind of, or not so subtly saying, it's like being under warlord control, it's like it's anyway. So and then the government has to sort of ban Halloween, which makes it look, which undermines its notion of being kind of,
I think it was
yeah.
it was your friend Orwell who said that every joke is a tiny revolution. Even though I know the quote's often taken out of context.
Yeah.
I think there's one more question back there. Well,
Hi, Jeff. Thanks. My name is Tiang. I'm a student here at George Washington University. I wanted to ask you, what made you drew the conclusion that students at Tiananmen Square ultimately was fighting for the Communist Party to reform itself rather than getting rid of it? I'm asking because, as you know, after Mao died, Deng Xiaoping worked really hard to reform the military, to jail one of Mao's wives, got the economy opened, got the foreign investment in, and set China up for, ultimately the WTO entry. Uh, I do agree that at the beginning of the protest, there was a lot of banners about nepotism and the elite's corruption. But ultimately, one of the very key terms during the negotiation between the Central Politburo and the student leaders were the recognition of Hu Yaobang's vision for democracy and freedom. And as everyone knew, that was a non-starter for the Communist Party. So I just wanted to kind of get your take on what made you draw the conclusion that it was more about nepotism and less about democracy.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I think it was actually that social movements to work have to appeal to multiple audiences. And I think and there was not so there was a way in which corruption was one of the themes that resonated most with, say, with workers who hadn't been followed. You could talk about things that would get people out. So there are going to be multiple desires. It's not that nobody desired, but even with people bringing up Hu Yaobang, it was partly calling on the Chinese Communist Party to re-engage with what had seemed the most promising aspect of the route it was going in. So it was not necessarily giving up on the idea that a communist party could stay in control, but it would have to be a different kind of one. And there was an idea associated with Hu Yaobang that he represented the road not taken by it. And admittedly, there were members of the Communist Party leadership who were not going to accept that, and that's part of why there's a crackdown. But it was more framed within a language of reform, and actually the critique of the the Hu Yaobang thing was also about like one veteran of Tiananmen who I talked to about it was one of the things that was so bad when they demoted Hu Yaobang was that it was Deng Xiaoping was acting like a kind of leader for life. And that was something we thought we had put behind us. We thought it was in some ways a throwback. And you had this symbolic debate between the two sides during 1989, very much within the discourses of China's own history and politics. The official criticism of the students was they were acting like Red Guards. The response was, no, you're the ones who have not outgrown the Mao era. But there was still some notion that it might be possible to have something that was different, but not necessarily completely. There was a complete exhaustion with Communist Party rule in Eastern and Central Europe, and a notion also of Communist Party rule having been imposed partly from outside and backed up by a foreign power. There's a book, Martin Dimitrov, called "Why Communism Didn't Fail or Didn't End." And what he notes is there were communist parties. There was this rhetoric, this misleading rhetoric of an end of communism in 1989, 91. And it ended except in North Korea, Vietnam, China, Laos, Cuba, all of which were places where the Communist Party came to power, partly with a kind of rhetoric of resisting foreign control, whereas it ended in these places where communism was Communist Party was seen as partly a foreign imposition. Anyway, it's a much larger question, but does that help situate me?
Hey, Jeff. Michael Rowan, Federal Research Division. So we talked, and I think one of the great aspects of the book is about the transnational aspects between the protesters, their connections, their sharing of tactics and technology. Do you have instances you've seen where there's like a similar sharing of tactics or strategies from Beijing to the regimes in those places? And I know you had referenced the earlier instances like the Stasi, but instances that we're seeing today.
That's a great question, and the Stasi one is something I did not know about, and I really going to use. There is, and most recently, and whether it could flow, which direction it flows, I'm not sure, but certainly there are ways in which the repression in Hong Kong and the repression in Thailand parallel each other. And who's exactly pioneering it and who's losing it, who's adapting, I'm not sure. But I learned the term recently, charge stacking. So Joshua Wong was sentenced to a few years in prison, most visible of early generation of Hong Kong activists. He wasn't arrested right away after the national security law came in. It wasn't like an instant rounding up of everybody. There were ways in which the Hong Kong authorities were trying not to create the same kind of focused international outrage that there had been after Tiananmen. There were not soldiers brought in. There was only police using things, using a lot of very intense force. But then there was a going after different sectors of society at different news cycles, sometimes far apart. And then when Joshua Wong was finally arrested in, I think, November of 2020, a few months after national security law, he only got, he was put on trial. It was a done deal. He was going to be sentenced. He was sentenced to a few years. They've now, the end of his sentence is coming up, they're retrying him, trying him for another charge related to something that happened before he went to prison. So they're putting somebody in prison on trial, which will have a potentially much longer sentence.
I think this is a Burmese technique. You tell me if I'm right or wrong.
Well,
I've interviewed people in Burma who were sentenced to 40, 50, 60 years. This is
that could be, yeah. So figuring out where it begins is a question with a lot of these things. But in Thailand, they're definitely doing the same thing with the person that was was youngish, but not one of the students. A human rights lawyer, Anand Nampa, was sentenced on lèse-majesté charge for a few years, and then they came up with other ones, and keep adding to these while he's in prison. And it makes for less of a news story, right? Because if you have, if you sentence somebody to 20 years in prison, that really has a different kind, you're really kind of ruining their life when you say like a few years, but then you make sure they're going to get it before they get
I
out.
think it also has a chilling effect on other observers in the community because it creates the thing that the Stasi valued most, which was uncertainty. You don't know where the story ends, and that's in its way the most demoralizing technique. I think there may be one more question here. And then they might throw us out of here. Okay, so we'll.
Hi, thank you. My name is Chloe. I'm a recent graduate of the Johns Hopkins SAIS grad program here and spent not this past year, but the year before at the Hopkins Center in China. And I'm curious in your coverage of protests across contexts, if you have a methodology for evaluating what makes a protest successful or impactful, because I found your point that looking at protests, you can really only see their impact much after the actual protest itself. And just seeing what's happening in the US today, and living in such a unpredictable time and recognizing that protests, as you said, are often quite emotional. I'm curious if you have developed any, I guess, strategies for in your, I guess, analysis of protests.
Yeah, that's really a great question. There have been some things I've been reading by other people about other places that have impacted, that have had a lot of influence on my thinking, and a lot of what I think, I even like things like scripts and repertoires, that's borrowed partly from sociologist Charles Tilly, then adapting to things that I see, and so I always see my work as in dialogue with things other people are doing. There's a guy, Gal Beckerman, who wrote a very good book called The Quiet Before, which talked about how often the things that we think of happening at a certain moment were percolating in kind of and slow, so a slow protest. Rebecca Solnit, who is writing, just has a new book that came out um, last month, a short book that says "No straight road takes you there," and she talks about taking a tortoise view rather than the mayfly view about things. And she talks about things that look like they were failed movements, but you actually look at how things have changed because of things that seemed like failed movements, or how long it took to do things like apartheid. Fails, 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 and then you get it. And there's also a book, Linda Gordon has a book, Seven Social Movements That Changed America. And she talks about things there too, where you have these long things. The Chartist movement was this very dramatic movement in England. This is one that Gal Beckerman talks about, where you have this dramatic, giant petition drive. And, these are efforts to get the vote spread, and it doesn't work. And it doesn't work. And then eventually it does. And then some of the techniques from it goes to men, and then some of the techniques are used at our suffrage. So you have to take, and the Eastern European thing again, if Václav Havel dies anytime before 1989, you think this is somebody who spent a big part of his life backing the wrong horse. But then you get, and these, Havel and Nelson Mandela are very important kind of symbols for these activists, because it suggests Taiwan. I mean, you could look at all kinds of things. We talk about how China is decades after Tiananmen, and you can't commemorate Tiananmen, but Taiwan, you were decades past the 228 before you could commemorate that.
I would add just a final fitting note on this point is that I've been talking to scholars of American history recently about what we can learn from the Gilded Age and the process of getting to the Progressive Era. And one of the lessons that comes through is persistence, that it was named the Gilded Age in 1873, and it took 17 years of public civil society action, in effect, before you even had the first law against monopoly. And then it took a full 40 years until you got a durable constitutional amendment that introduced the income tax. So the question in the end is not can you get people on one day, but can you get people to keep coming back? And part of the way is by writing about it, I think. Folks, I think Jeff is going to be signing books. I hope that you'll take one or two or three home. Father's Day is coming. And I will be too, but
And-
less important. And
But I'm also glad that they've got the Age of Ambition out there, which I want to say the book I mentioned, Chinese Characters, that I co-edited with Anjali Shah, had the first chapter in a book, I think, that Evan published.
True.
And it was something about how complex hyper-nationalist was, who was also a polite, cosmopolitan kind of guy. So I think making room in your mind for for contradictions within individuals is important. And also, if there was one thing I would say, in a kind of pragmatic sense to people who are concerned about what's happening in America, if you're pushing back, you should think about what's happened in other parts of the world in one place or another. And here I have to just mention something that I learned. You can always think of, you're focused on one place that you forget something that's happening, to how relevant other places can be. I was in DC for an Asian studies meeting in the 2010s, and I was focused on my China world, and I met up with Evan's wife, Sarah Beth, and we were talking about other things like catching up in life. We're friends, and she said, you're at this meeting, but you've got to leave the meeting and go see the protest, the Parkland activist protest. And I was like in my zone of being a specialist. When I'm in China, I'm looking at whatever's happening on the streets. And it was so important that I took her advice and I went there. And some of what I've said about not discounting and thinking about a kind of the activists in the Milk Tea Alliance thing, one thing that binds them is a notion that an older generation has just kicked the can down the road in something that's ruining their lives and is going to ruin large parts of their lives. And that's a kind of connecting thread there. So I'm very grateful. I'm grateful to Evan for many things, but I'm really grateful to his wife for making sure that I didn't miss that crucial moment.
So I'm going to tell her that.
That is, I think that's an optimistic note to end on, the passing of the baton and the future, the kind of the hopeful future as well. So everyone, please join me in thanking these two wonderful experts. We're glad to have them here. So Evan and Jeff will both be available to sign books. Our friends at JF have their table up. We encourage you to grab a copy if you haven't yet. There's some food in the back, and we hope you'll stay, mix, mingle, get to know each other as well. A cross-section of GW students, established China hands here. So thank you so much for coming, and we hope you'll stick around. Thanks.